Hey everybody, this is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton, and welcome to episode number 228. So this is a not a short episode, but this is an episode on a patient of mine who I have treated and since discharged. And Susan and I were just talking about about a few things before we hopped on, and the wrist and the elbow came up, and that is an area of the body that we as physical therapists, we do treat, obviously, right? So, but this comes in to play when this guy or this patient of mine uh, had issues with pull up and push up, and you'll see why the elbow became a very important factor in his presentation and certain movements that I assessed. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome. Our website is toughtotreat.com. And if you have any questions regarding any region of the body, right, Susan, just type in our search bar the regions, and all, I mean, we're at 228 at this point, so the number will come up. And for our older listeners, thank you so much. This is our sixth year, and we're so appreciative of all of you. And for those of you who have not left us on a review wherever you listen to us, we'd appreciate if you could do that. It really helps with the algorithm and helps people find us. Anything else to add, Susan, or should we just
Think we should just get to the episode.
get right into it? Sounds good. Hey everybody, this is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton, and welcome to episode number 228. Couldn't resist, Susan. It's just those
I
numbers
know.
still cease to amaze me that I've sat in front of this
Always,
computer with you for
always.
228 times. It really does. It's crazy.
Mhm.
As I mentioned in the intro, so we'll get right to it. I'm just looking through my notes here. This patient I actually have treated and discharged. I don't even like to say the word discharge. I've treated and let go. We're not even let go because I don't think we end up discharging people. I mean, we let them go and then they come back for different things. And so, but I stopped seeing him about a few weeks ago. Okay. So I may have done a short episode on something related to him over the summer. I don't remember if I did. I am happy to put the link in. I'll have to take a look. But this guy, I'll tell you really quickly, Susan, his history. In his, I would say, early 40s, former military Army infantry here for the US, has a desk job here in New York City right now, and had a lot of issues with pull up and push up. And he did the sort of the typical military, I don't know if there is a typical military workout, but he did mostly body weight exercises, several versions of push-ups: narrow, normal, wide, diamond push-ups. He did pull-ups with different grips, the same thing. Okay. And I'll just give you his medical or his injury or movement history, what set him up, what kept him there, type thing. And we'll get into it. The reason why I wanted to talk about him was I got him doing a push-up fairly early, but the pull-up was delayed, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. I've discharged him now, but it's something that happens to all of us. And I was trying to figure out what else there was that was going on with him. Anyway, he jumping out of helicopters multiple times during when he was in the Army, fractured several ribs in 2006. He also fell in the shower, so a lot of rib dysfunction. Um, he also had bilateral plantar fasciitis, left greater than right. No real, symptoms when I saw him. He had, this is his words, not mine, pulling in my armpits bilaterally. He felt that his ribs were constantly shifted, suffered a left stress fracture to his metatarsal and a right stress fracture to his other metatarsal during the Army. Not surprising. Has sprained both of his ankles, sleeps about 5 hours a night. Has, let's see any other history. He runs. His when he was running, he had stopped running because of his plantar fasciitis, and otherwise he That was his main form of cardio. Before he was in the Army, he was a boxer and fighter. Okay, with and without gloves. And he did tell me that a lot of times his elbows would be strained. And there were many times where he would put braces around his elbows and they would make everything feel better. Let me see, other sports played. Yeah, some baseball, basketball, but it was mostly boxer fighter in 2008 to 2012. His main workouts is 5 years of calisthenics, like your typical non-body, full body weight type of movement. And that's what he is doing now. Okay. And he wanted to be able to go back and doing that. His chief complaint was left-sided upper trap, shoulder, upper rib pain with doing a wide based push-up and a pull-up. Doesn't matter what grip on the pull-up. Okay, wide-based push-ups, mostly push-ups, but wider. I would say push-ups in general, wider was worse than the normal push-up. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. No surgeries. He did have the stress fractures, falling off the helicopters. Yeah, I mean, there's a significant history here, do you have any questions so far, or should I keep going?
No, go ahead and keep going. It's just got a complex history.
Yeah, and so I'm just going through notes here. So basically, his main issue is pull up or push up. And so what I did is I just took a look at him in standing, as I always do. I look at him where his center of mass is. And it was way to the left. Head, thorax, pelvis, all left. His symptoms were on his left. So what I ended up doing, and I don't know if the listeners, for maybe some of our advanced listeners, I mean, I'm at my skill level, I certainly can assess a push-up on the wall. There's no way I can have somebody go down on the floor and get my body over them and manually assess a push-up on the floor. That's like really hard to do. So I had him go on the wall. And even in standing, I just sort of brought his awareness. Do you realize you're standing on your left side? Oh no, I didn't know that. Put him in the mirror. I took a picture. I'm telling you, Susan, picture is worth 1,000 words.
Always.
Our listeners do anything today, take a picture with permission and if you have an iPhone, go into this, because one of my therapists who I mentor, she's like, I didn't know you could do this. So take the picture with your iPhones. I don't know what on the Android, but you have an Android, right? So take that, then go into edit, click, good, you're good. Take the picture, go into edit. And then you have lines that you can edit it with. And you could literally put the line in the center of their feet and go right up and you'll see. And I actually airdrop these to my Mac here and I put them on preview, but he was like, oh my God, I'm so far to my left. So I brought that awareness to him and he was like, oh, no wonder. And so people start thinking of how they moved, whether that's a good or bad thing, because some people can fixate on it, but he was not aware that he was on his left side.
Yep. Just like we talked about the last podcast, 227, with the gentleman with the knee issue was chronically overloading the right side. Right. And the picture takes is worth 1,000 words, like we talked about on that podcast.
Yep.
All phones have edit versions on pictures. You can always, it doesn't matter which phone you have.
Yeah, I agree.
Just get permission, take pictures.
Yeah, totally. And I will tell you this right now.
You can look at it later too, and helps you kind of see things that you might not see in the moment when you're in a hurry.
That's correct. And plus and I have a mirror, but a picture, as you said, is worth 1,000 words. So what I did was in standing, because the left shoulder was an area of meaning to him and it was relevant to him. People want to feel felt, even if you think in your heart of hearts that the shoulder is not even anywhere near their driver. There's no way that the shoulder is going to be is going to be the cause of this problem. You got to put your hands on it, even if it's just for 5 seconds, because there's so many times when people say, come in and they've seen somebody else and they're like, they didn't even touch my knee. I'm like, okay, well, you need to touch the person, right? At the very, just put your hands on it. You don't have to overanalyze this. So anyway, I did. So he had a lot of medial compression in his shoulder. You could just see it. You could just see it. This is not rocket science. You could see it. He was very compressed in his left shoulder. And then I went up into his rib cage and I just spanned the ribs. Everybody's got shifts here and there. And I just sort of wanted to see, if he was sore anywhere, because he had several rib fractures. He's fallen out of planes. I needed to assess that. And so what I did was, because the pull-up and the push-up were so different, I ended up doing, this is what I started with. I ended up analyzing a push-up on the wall. So what I did was, if our listeners have a hard time assessing that, and I know that's not easy to do, okay? I mean, you can look at it, you can feel it. It's obvious if the person's shifting left or translating in a way that's not optimal for their shoulder, you can see that. What I did was, in standing as well, I just had him do a squat. He didn't have a problem sitting, didn't have a problem squatting, didn't have a problem running, but I just wanted to see where that dominant pattern was. Did he center? Did he, and once again, he went further left. So the dominant movement patterns, we've talked about this, they carry those across multiple activities. So if the listeners can't do the push-up on the wall, do a squat and make it relevant. Touch their shoulder, touch their back, whatever. Make it relevant to the patient and connect with them. Because if you don't connect with them and the person's like, you never touched my shoulder, everything you've done will be ineffective, because that's all they're thinking about. They never touched the area of my body that hurts. And I'm the same way. I have a shoulder issue right now, and I'm like, I want someone to touch my freaking shoulder. Okay. I want someone to touch it because it hurts, and I'm not unusual in that regard. Anyway, so I had him go on the wall. I had him start off. We've always talked about normal, narrow, wide. And I want to ask your opinion on this before we even go into the objective. Because he was doing well, and then I got stuck at the pull-up. So I will fast forward to that. But in the past, we've always said people who are more, if they go wider base, especially with their feet, they tend to maybe look a little bit better, because their upper extremity can adapt to the base of support. When he went wide, he was way worse. So I had him go a normal push-up. I had just literally on the wall. He was really okay with that. He did have a lot of, we're thinking about, he's had some wrists. What do boxers do? They wrap their wrists when they fight. They wrap their wrists. Right. And he had wear braces sometimes, but when he went wide on the wall, you could see he went way to the left, his shoulder immediately compressed. Why do you think that is? A wider base would be worse than a narrow? I have my theories. Just for the listeners, because intuitively, because we've harped on the narrow is generally better, but not all the time. And this is a case where it was not. It was worse wide.
When I'm thinking about narrow versus wide, the first thing that comes into my mind is neural tension. But if they're worse wide, then it's probably not a typical neural tension type of piece. I think what happens when we go wide with the upper body, like of the arms on the wall, that if they can't handle, or if they're already over rotated, like in their joint, or their joint is being forced into a rotation, like their shoulders being forced into a rotation because something isn't moving at the wrist or the elbow. It's just like when you squat, if your knees don't bend, you're going to change the hip hinge. You're going to hip hinge differently, or if your tibia doesn't glide over the talus the way it's supposed to, it's going to change the angle of the knee. Or if the knee isn't, able to, do its counter rotation, that's going to change. So when we see this going wide, we have to look at what's happening all the way from where the hand is onto the wall, all the way into the shoulder and the neck, because there's probably, the first thing I wrote down when you were going through the timeline was that there were some neural tension issues with this guy.
Yep.
All the way through. You can't do all of this stuff and not end up with neural tension issues, especially when they start complaining about pulling in their armpits. And then all of a sudden plantar fasciitis and
bilateral.
Yeah. He wasn't ever sick, was he? Did he ever have like an illness or?
No, just COVID.
But that was later. I'm talking about earlier on or anything like that.
No, I asked that.
Yeah, so kind of interesting. But so my question is like, what did his elbow look like? What did his wrist look like? Was he moving them in a certain way different than the right side? It was causing more compression into his left shoulder?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what I'm thinking. Because I had a patient a while ago as well who had a similar issue, and she had significant frozen shoulder. So So what I assessed his wall push-up, that's what I was thinking too, because of he wrapped his wrists. So when you're people who don't know boxing, he's a right-handed fighter. So he's going to put his left arm up in front. He'll punch with his right arm, but he's going to
Mhm.
grip a lot with his left. And if there's people out there who treat a lot of boxers and fighters, if I'm wrong, please let me know. But he was showing me his stance, and he punched a lot with his right, but held his left arm up to sort of protect his face. But he wrapped his wrists every single time, and he did wear braces outside of the ring as well. And so on his elbows, and I'm sitting here thinking, there's no way that the wrist or the elbow or neural tension is not a part of this. There has to be.
Right.
That was my
Mhm.
hypothesis before I even watched him move.
Mhm.
So I had him on the wall. I had him do the wall push-up, and I just watched him, and he went way left. His upper, like his you can see his lower and middle to lower thorax went way left. His head went way left. It was obvious. I took a picture of it. I showed it to him. I mean, it was, you could just see it. His left shoulder hiked. It was not optimal, not optimal. And
Mhm.
I went very narrow. And he's like, "Oh, that feels a lot better." I'm like, okay, well, there's something in this piece, this non-optimal, loading. But this was even on the wall. It wasn't even a full push-up. And so
Mhm.
what I ended up doing, just because I was curious, I had him go on the floor with those tricep bars so his wrist wouldn't be in extension.
Mhm.
And I just said, just because I just had to observe him. I just said, go normal, narrow, wide. And I go as wide as you would do it in your house. And he's
Mhm.
like, oh, this feels a lot better, but
Mhm.
just normal. Then what I did, I had him go on a decline. So I had him lift his legs up and put on a bench. So I wanted to see if it was the load or the position, or, so I had him go same position. I had him go, um, take the tricep bars out, had him go wrist extension, but I had him lift his legs up. So he was in a big decline. And he's like, oh, that's no good. Same
Mhm.
thing with wrist extension. I had him put the bars on, kept his legs up on the decline bench. Oh, that's a lot better. So playing with the position of his wrist made him
Mhm.
significantly better. And I'm like, okay. So I went to check. I know you know what this is coming. His upper limb tension test, just in sitting,
Mhm.
because based on the history, and we always talk about the history, the wrapping of the wrist, the elbow on the elbow, the fighter, right? So the bilateral plantar fasciitis, the rib cage, the thorax houses the sympathetic nervous system. So I had him do that, and I'm showing you, Susan. It's just I just basically put him in sitting. I didn't make this fancy. I didn't get him supine. I was just bend your elbow, keep your wrist in neutral, and try to extend in that typical upper limb tension test. And you could see, Susan, I'm doing this on the Zoom here, but he couldn't extend his wrist. I
Yeah.
mean, he
The
couldn't
only
extend his elbow.
they can't get their arm up, they can't get their shoulder, they can't get their
Compression.
arm up into like a 90-degree abduction through that position. It's like,
Right.
woo.
No,
Mhm.
completely. And the right's fine. And so I said, okay, can you turn your thorax? I had him do everything. Turn your head, look down, look up, just move. And can I get any more movement out of this? And the only time I did was when I went up and I'm really fast forwarding here because I want to get to the pull-up. Okay. So I went up into his axilla, and I just centered him, gave him a little decompression, centered him. And then I had him go on the wall first and do the push-up with a wider base. He's like, oh, that feels a lot better. I'm really gripping like crazy. And then I took him off the wall, sat him back on the plinth, and I was holding up his thorax. Said, can you, once again, decompressing mostly in his middle thorax, and had him do the upper limb tension test. It was still restricted, but it was better. It was better. So I'm fast forwarding through this. What I ended up doing with him, because the wide base with the bars was so much easier, and he preferred the bars. I'm like, go for it. Go with the bars,
Yeah.
practice. So in
Yeah.
terms of that's what I did. And so in terms of manual work, I ended up get in a seated. This is a good one, just FYI for people, in a seated position with their arms on the plinth. He was in sort of like a dive position, like he's going to dive on the table. And then I had a wheelie stool. He sat on the wheelie stool, and then I just had him move his arms in different positions, while I was sort of with my hands in his rib cage. And you could see the medial compression, the serratus turning on, the lats turning on. Those are not optimal. And then we don't talk a ton about, soft tissue here. I'll just spend 2 minutes on it. But, you know, I ended up releasing his lats, his serratus in that position, not in supine. I had to do a movement that was going to engage those muscles. I had him keep his hands on the table and turn turn the wheelie stool. So that wound up his neural tension. So if you put your hands on the table in this sort of externally rotated position, like you're resting on the table, and you turn your trunk to the right, you're going to feel a pulling in the left pec. And he did that. And I did some work in and around the shoulder area, in his thorax, and his low and his mid back. I will suffice, anybody has questions on that, they can email us. I'm good because I want to move on. I did a lot of movement that would engage that barrier. And I had him go, we have a Pilates reformer. I had him do a wide, so for those of you who do Pilates, I had him do a knee stretch where you're on your hands and knees and his arms are wide. For those of you who don't have access to a reformer, you can go hands and knees wide, have him do rock backs, anything, put the hands in like a clock position, any position to engage the barrier. And he did well with that. And so I had him do push-ups on the wall. I had him at home. He was fine doing push-ups in a normal and narrow base. And his wide was still a bit off, but he was okay with that. So then I looked at the pull-up. This is where I want curious.
Before we get to pull-ups, I have something I just want to interject here.
Yeah.
I love all of this and engaging the barrier and everything. I just want to bring the listener back to when you actually put your hands on the both sides of his rib cage, you know, up high, to give him a little bit of decompression by compressing in just a little bit. You know, you told the story of him, how he always used his left arm to protect his face.
Yes.
I'm wondering if that compression helped his nervous system feel safer so that he could let his left arm go.
Yeah.
As there's an emotional, you know, biopsychosocial kind of consideration here, that if that's always the protective arm, the shield arm that they talk about in other ways and other movement patterns in martial arts and Tai Chi, and you know, there's a whole thing with the shield, and there's a whole complete different movement pattern that goes with it because of the protection. So you have the attack and the protection, the attack and the protection. And I'm just wondering if it was probably, you know, ingrained in him to not allow that arm to move out because it was needing to stay in protection mode all the time.
Yep.
You know, on a sub level underneath there. And by coming in, I love that because I want everyone to understand that, you know, you gave his rib cage some compression, which allowed him to like not have to hold his shoulder up. But it's also, there's something about when we come in on somebody like that onto their torso or their trunk or wherever it may be, that if our intention is right, that, you know, the protection piece is safe for the client to move.
Yeah.
And I think that's a piece of it too. And I didn't want us to miss that because, you know, even in a, a machismo type presentation like this, there's still nervous system issues. And the guy only sleeps 5 hours a night.
I know.
Don't think he sleeps with one eye open? Come on. I mean, right? You know, so anyway, I just didn't want that one to go by. I wanted everyone to kind of hear that a little bit because that just the safety in itself can allow him to move that arm better. And then that's what you did. You made it safe for him to get on the ground, to put his hands on the, you know, keeping his wrist in extension. You gave him an activity to do that was relevant to what he wanted to do in a way that he could actually accomplish it and not worry.
Yes.
So that safety piece is so important in there. You know, that container for him was like he was listened to, he was heard, and, you know, the modifications were in line with what he was hoping for. Like, you know, like, I want to do these things. That's why I'm here, because I can't do them.
Yes.
And we showed him a way that he could, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I
Plus,
agree
I
100%.
love the variance of doing the you know, press ups around the clock. You know,
Yes.
like, you know, not just in one position, but can you do it from this position? Can you do it from that position?
Yeah, and you think about nervous system, it sort of refreshes the, you know, the quote unquote homunculus, and it gives you options for movement. The brain needs choices, whether you want to take them or not. You need options. And, you know, that left fighting stance comes into play in the pull-up. And So for the listeners, I did a lot of, I did down dog into chaturanga, hands and knees, yeah, we have these things where you do wall lands. Did I do open chain with him? I did. He was doing a lot of his workout, biceps. He was doing a lot of it on his own. He had zero problem with any of those. I have him supine and do a little bit of, TheraBand. Yeah, but maybe for a week or two. To be honest, this wasn't the kind of exercise program where he needed to pump out a yellow TheraBand. I did use those, Susan, I forgot to mention those orange Franklin balls. So I put
Mhm.
one under each armpit and to give him more space. And that was really quite good. He was able to do a push-up very well with that. So he simulated that at home with washcloths. And he was able not to compress into that. So I did do that. He was doing lat pull downs and so we modified a lot of his workout because he really still wanted to do that. And I don't think we should tell people not to work out. I mean, he should, but we just make some modifications in the short term. The tricep bars were very important. I will be honest. So from a neural tension perspective, that makes sense. You take tension off of one end and he's able to go. So anyway, he was moving along well, doing his workout, and then the pull-up. I assessed the pull-up at the beginning. And it got him 50% with the pull-up, not even. And every time and this goes back to the elbow, what you just talked about with the protective mechanism.
Mhm.
So the pull-up, so he didn't know which part of the pull-up it bothered him, whether it was pulling up or letting go. And I watched him, I videoed him, and he did the pull-up, he pulled up, and then as he let go, no, it didn't matter if it was a narrow grip or a wider grip. Where do you think? So he walks up to, we have a fuse ladder, Pilates fuse ladder. He walked up the ladder, put his hands on the bar, let go, and then he lowered down. Where do you think he went when he lowered down?
All the way to the left.
You got it.
Yep, because he didn't let the left side go.
That's right. It was obvious. And I videoed that. And I used that every time he came in because he was like, oh my God. He went way, and you could see there's a board on our fuse ladder that you could see from the board. There was no space on the board when he went to the left. He was so far, and I slow-moed it and everything. And I was like, okay, they're clearly, and it was on the eccentric part. So it was on the lowering. So it was like he couldn't extend that elbow and that he could not extend that arm. Same impairment, right, as the push-up in a way, but he was translating way to the left. And so what I ended up doing, I did what every good physiotherapist would do. I would look around down the chain, and I went into his elbow and I went into his wrist. I went into the biceps. I played around with the neural tension piece in supine. This was straight supine, textbook assessment of the elbow joint. Okay. And he was off the table through the charts. Like I'm barely touching like his medial joint line in his left elbow. He's through the charts off the table. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't expect that. He did, bear in mind, what did he say in his story? He put braces on his elbows and it made him feel better. Okay, that's not what you should be doing. And so I ended up doing a lot of, some sort of traditional PT work in the elbow, and I did some neural tension pieces. So I had him supine, and I really did. I had to go back. I don't see a ton of, I mean, obviously we see tennis and golfer's elbow, but I don't see a ton of like straight wrist issues, right? Or straight elbows. They're always linked to something else, like this guy is, right? And so I ended up having him do the movement, the lying in supine, doing the median nerve glide, the neural tension piece, and I was facilitating a better movement pattern. Same thing I did in the thorax. I put my hands around his elbow joint. I decompressed his medial joint line, lateral joint line, and gave him space for movement. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but I gave him a better movement pattern. I just decompressed one hand on distal, radial ulnar, one hand on proximal, and I decompressed it and I had him do median nerve glides. I had him do wrist extension, wrist flexion, pronation, supination, anything. Because at the end of the day, when you're coming in a pull-up, you're pronating, you're supinating and pronating in the pull-up and push-up. So I did do that. And I went in and did, a little work in his biceps. Once again, straight manual, soft tissue work. I got him up. This is what I want to talk about with the exercise piece here real quick. I got him up after doing all that manual work. I assessed his median nerve glide. I assessed his push-up on the wall. I didn't want to make anything worse. He was still good with those. So his push-up got much better quickly. I put him on the fuse ladder again, had him go down. He was better, but still going to the left. So I will tell you what I did exercise wise, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. Because I didn't really touch his elbow or wrist to get the push-up better. I had to do it for the pull-up because of the way he was coming down to the left. I still think it was that dominant movement pattern, but I think there was an impairment in that elbow because of his past movement history that was not challenged enough in the push-up. It was challenged more in the pull-up. What do you think? Yeah, right?
Yeah, I agree. You
Yeah.
know, and I think it's because, the push, it's just different. It's
They're
just
different.
it's closed chain versus almost like open chain. Even
Mm-hmm.
though it's closed chain, pulling the body up and lowering the body down is very different. Plus the weight is different, but just the
Total.
movement having to go into shoulder flexion, elbow extension.
Mm-hmm.
So the wrist piece wasn't nearly as important as the elbow.
Yeah,
Whereas on the push-up, the wrist became really important because it limited the elbow of what it could do. And
correct.
in the other way, the pull-up, he's still in wrist extension, but he's unable to move his elbow in those directions. So he
Couldn't
has to
extend
pull
it.
to the left in order to do it, or to try to do it, or that's what his brain has set up for him. And so he didn't have any variance to get out of that. And then lowering down required him to not only go into elbow extension, but into shoulder flexion.
Yeah, and he didn't
You
have his
know,
feet to center himself. He
right,
was,
right, yeah, he's hanging in the air.
yeah,
So it's like, you're gonna go to where the restriction is.
yeah,
It's just like if you tie up a rubber band on one side and not on the other, and you pull it, it's gonna drift over to the side where the
yeah,
tension is.
yeah.
So,
So no, absolutely. So what I did with him there is, I did, I had to get him in elbow extension, wrist extension, not with a pull up because that would be ridiculous to do as an exercise. I mean, because he was still not doing it wonderfully. So, and I ended up having him do this is a traditional, tricep kickbacks. I had him take a weight and keep just basic. You could take whatever. I mean, he was Susan when I tell you. I'm like, how much? Because he was doing tricep kickbacks and biceps. I'm like, what's the weight you're doing? Oh, 45 pounds. I'm like, okay, that's way too much. I'm like, show me, because we had the weight and the significant compensation to the left, especially in the standing tricep kickback. He was shaking like a leaf. I'm like, okay, number one, you need to take the weight down. If you want to do this weight, do it for 2 reps. I mean, from a psychological perspective, I understand that you need to do heavier weight, but you need to take this down a bit because the weight's too much for you and you're just feeding into that non-optimal pattern. So what I
yeah.
had to do, because I wanted to get that wrist extension, the elbow extension, I had him do a very, I worked with him a little bit on what weight. I think we ended up like 25 pounds in a tricep kickback. And he was very good with that, but I had him do cueing. I had the imagery that we often talked about. Imagine you've got a big balloon in the armpit. Imagine those orange Franklin balls are in your armpits. Imagine you want to, float your shoulder blade. Think of something happy. Whatever image worked for him. Okay. And he ended up, I had him doing a lot of just basic traditional tricep kickbacks in different stride stance positions, in squat and stride stance. And then I had him doing eccentric biceps. So once again, I didn't even have him doing, I just no concentric right now, just because of the way of the movement pattern going into elbow extension. I just said, take your right hand, help your left elbow up, go slowly, think of your cue, go slowly all the way down, back and forth, cueing and just eccentric only. And then I had him do, he was still doing his nerve glides I had him do nerve glides in like sitting rotation. I had him doing lower trunk rotation with the nerve. I had him put his wrist on the like the Pilates Cadillac, just on a surface and turning, just anything to keep the extensibility of the nerve happy or the nerve happy. And he did that and he was very compliant with everything. And so we progressed honestly, all he was doing biceps, triceps, that was it. And he was going back to his full push-up workout. and we progressed it and he was good to go. So the issue is that I would say that, what's the motto here? The motto is always look back into their history, but the motto here is that the pull-up, he just wasn't, if no one videoed his pull-up and you just took it as routine, and I know not many people can always video pull-ups in their practice, have somebody video it for him, or have him I had him go prone on the reformer and the Pilates reformer, holding onto the bar and doing a pull-up that way. You can go prone on the box or just prone right on the reformer and just do pull-ups on the reformer, easy that way. And I actually did a lot of training with him there on the reformer because I couldn't obviously get him to do them pull-ups all the time. So I had him training on the reformer, do almost like a military press, but it was like a reverse military press, and just putting my hands in his thorax and his glenohumeral joint, just basically training him and giving him cues. And my hands were on him that whole time. And so that's what I did. And besides the triceps and biceps, so it's just a lot of training in an unloaded position on the reformer. You could even, if you don't have access to a reformer, you could, you could do, I'm just trying to think what else we could do, Susan, because I have access to this. You almost could do like, go on the wall and, put a TheraBand under your feet and go up and down with the wall, like into like a military press on the wall. It's not going to be the same, but you can train that elbow extension going up high. So that was his main impairment. So ultimately, if I just continuing to treat the neural tension, treating the thorax and the shoulder, did not get that pull-up better. Okay. And then I went back and I said, oh, it's got to be something in locally in the elbow. And it was. And it was because of his history. And so he's, pretty good to go now. So I wanted to bring him up because I learned a lot working with him, and I thought he was just a heck of a lot of fun to be around. So
just remember that your clients will show you everything you need to do. You simply have to look for it. And I know everybody keeps saying, what do you do first? What do we do first? And the first thing you do is you look.
Yes.
You listen, you ask questions, and you stay in a state of curiosity.
Yes.
Because that's where you'll get the answers when you're curious. I'm curious about that. Tell me more about that. Like, is there a particular reason that you do it this way or this way? What is going on with your mind? What do you think, let's get back to those 3 questions. What do you think is going on? What do you want to change? What do you hope for? Like, what do they really want to get out of this? What will that do for them? And in your heart of hearts, what are you really worried about? Like to get to where it is that this guy really wanted to. He wasn't going to give up doing his push-ups. They hurt too bad. Yeah, and he was not happy about that. He wanted to do them.
Yeah.
So that was an important movement pattern for him for whatever reason. It's not for us to say people shouldn't do this or people should do this, or people, if they didn't do that, they wouldn't do, whatever. That's not our job. Our job is to, let's see what we can figure out. And that's exactly what you did all the way through. And it's step by step and layer by layer, and it wasn't one thing. It was like the neural tension needed to be dealt with. The rib mobility needed to be improved and optimized.
Yes.
The position of the shoulder and the wrist needed to change. And eventually the elbow needed some treatment.
Yep.
And then we needed to pull it all back together into the movement pattern. Not just like strengthening something to strengthen it, but to how does this work in the movement pattern that's desired?
He gave the answers basically, but you mentioned curious. If we're not curious, I mean, I take a solid, and look, and I'm lucky I can do this, a solid 30 minutes on the narrative. Okay, because if he didn't mention elbows and wrists, like, I'm not a fighter. I don't treat a ton of fighters, but if he didn't mention that, if I didn't ask that, it would have taken a lot longer. And I think that it's really important for the listeners to spend the time at the beginning in the first session, being curious. Obviously you're curious throughout, but asking these questions, because you need to have an 80%, what's the word, 80% of their diagnosis or movement patterning or where you think the driver is going to come from what they're telling you. And then you have to prove yourself wrong, right? So, or right, whatever you want to look at it. So did I assess an arm movement? Did I look through his shoulder and test his cuff? No, I did not. I'm like, this guy can't do a push-up. Let's see you do a push-up on the wall. That is so, and that'll save you a lot of time. And I know people have to do certain movement patterns for reimbursement. You can do that. Those take 2 minutes, right? But when you're seeing patients who've been around, who are very complex, you need to assess the movement, or at least look at the movement that's bothering them. And if you feel comfortable at your skill level to do that, you need to assess that. Once again, as I mentioned before, you could have assessed a squat. You just need to make it relevant to them.
Yep. And I think that that's so important, when you were talking about you have to do certain movement patterns or test certain movement patterns for reimbursement. We also should be writing functional goals.
Yeah.
And, the impairment level isn't always going to take us to the functional goal, because there was probably 20 impairment problems with this guy. What was the most relevant to get him to his functional goal of push-ups and pull-ups? That's what needed to be done, right?
I know he had neural, probably fascial, firstly neural, fascial, probably some joint stuff. I mean, definitely, biopsychosocial stuff. I mean, you have all these four, you've got
and muscle inhibition and muscle overactivation.
Overactivity.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So all of those things need to be considered, but they need to be considered along the line of getting somebody to where they want to go, what the functional movement pattern is that they are really desiring to have, to be able to accomplish, to optimize.
Yeah, because it's meaningful to them. If you have to connect the patient to the process, because if they're not connected, then you're wasting your time. And that's why I wanted to bring him up. He was a joy to work with. And I really went very quickly through treatment. So if anybody has questions, just email us. But I wanted to go to the pull-up because that has what stuck me. And I know this happens to everybody. When you get stuck, go back to the narrative, go back to their history, think about what they told you. If I hadn't asked about the elbows, ask it then. Just, is there something that maybe we go back to the movement history, just be curious, as Susan said, be curious throughout. Don't just assume, be curious, because there are people, people are going to say, oh, I forgot to tell you that, because they're going to forget, even if you ask them. It's human nature, right? It's human nature. So, well, thank you, Susan. This was good.
Thank you, Erica. Great story. Great thought, clinical reasoning and patterning and looking at all of these things. And, it just brings up the whole idea of movement across diagonals. And, he had one serious diagonal restriction that had an integrative problem, not just one, lots and lots of things. So, and it was really affecting his ability to do some of these, to leverage some of these power movements that he wanted to do.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you the next time, and stay curious.
Exactly.